wanted to show you a problem that I ran into a little while ago. In Unity, we have this feature called coroutines. And a coroutine is basically just, it's an enumerable return. It means that it's a function that can return something and then return another thing and another thing and another thing. This is great for the processing of lists, where you might not care about getting everything in the list, but you wanted to start searching for items in the list where the date of the last purchase they made was in the last 30 days. So you look through the list, and every time it checks the date of every single one, and as soon as it comes across one where it has it, it's going to yield return that element that has the sale that happened on that day, to get all the rest of the details back. And then your other function that's calling on it can decide whether or not it wants it to even continue with all of this. One of the common things that would happen in the past before this was around is that you would just write a function that would just do a sort for everything. It would grab a function. Anyway, that's not really the big thing. One of the big things about this is that it limits the processing, and it's this really great feature of C#. And of course, other languages have very similar operations. But there is a very big challenge with how Visual Studio and the compiler error on things. I was writing some code and I had coroutines in it, and I ended up deciding that I needed to step away from coroutines and or enumerable functions, and I needed to make this move over to just a simple void. You call a function, the function does the stuff, and then it returns the processing all at once. Now, it doesn't necessarily need to be a void. It could be a string. Any of those things are fine. But I want to show you this. Let's say that I put a piece of problem code in here. Like, this is a void main. Like, let's say I say return 22. Well, it shows me that I have an error on this line. It says, this returns void. A return keyword must not be followed by an object expression. It's putting the error on this line, which this line is what shouldn't work. We've already clarified that this method is a void method. So Visual Studio identifies that. The compiler identifies that. If I hit, let's go build solution, what I want to do is go to view, and then I want to bring up the issues or the output. So let's go to the error list. So the error list also points it to here, but I also want to point out one other thing. Let's go view and output. So on this output, we get this error, and it clarifies where that error is. Everything is saying that that is happening on line 15. Line 15. Specifically, column 13, line 15, column 13, line 15 to line 19, or 19 is here. Okay, but it's identifying that this is the point of the error. And that makes sense. That is the point of the error. However, there's another error that can happen here. Yield return null. This happened in particular because I was using coroutines and needed to change it over to a void method. I didn't need this process to just happen in steps. I needed it to complete all of its work, and it had no reason to be interrupted anymore. So I turned that feature off. So when I did that, let me show you where this error is. Yield, yield return null. Suddenly, this return line is no longer the error. This is not what's at fault. Your main function is. Oh, well, your main function is broken now. The body of program main cannot be an iterator block because void is not an iterator interface. It's pointing out that the error is here. This took me about 6 hours to figure out what the problem was. And one of the key things was that I didn't notice that I had a yield return null. Usually when there's an error, the error is on the line that's underlined or sometimes right before it. And even if that's not the point of the error, it gives you enough information to really clarify and understand that. But it gets tough. Like in this function where we have several return calls, what happens if one of them was a yield return? Well, null would be... Look at this. I put this in here. This method, this line right here, is not what the system thinks is at fault. This is one of the big reasons why this took me so long to debug. Because now look at this. It thinks that the method is broken. Again, this cannot be an iterator block. But I'm looking at this. It's not an iterator block. And I come over to here where we've got a return call on it. And I'm looking at this like, what are you complaining about? This is a string method. It's supposed to return a string. Why isn't that working? And so I look at this and I'm like, okay, well, it's also got this here. It says cannot return a value from an iterator. But this is not an iterator. This is just a simple data type, a string or an array. It is a string. If this were an integer or a float or whatever, it would give me the same type of result. This, I have to call this out as a bug on Microsoft's side. I mean, I'd love to hear the reasoning why this is not, but this is an obnoxious error. Yield return null, where I get an error on this one where the body of whatever the method is cannot be an iterator because string is not an iterator interface type. Great. And I'm looking at this one, same thing. Cannot return a value from an iterator. Use the yield return statement to return a value type because this one is obviously broken, even though it matches what the method name is. I wasted the majority of a day of work trying to fix a very simple issue. It was a big pain until eventually this was on a rubber duck call with some other developers where some other developers were just helping me look through my code to find it, that I ended up realizing what was going on with it. And I found a yield return null. Also, I want to point out that one of the reasons, like I even looked for yield returns inside of it because of the fact that I had originally had it as an enumerator. I had it as an enumerator function where yield return was one of the types that I expected it to be. But one of the reasons I did not see it when I was looking for it in the first place is because this is how I had it laid out. I was looking for my return lines at the beginning of lines, and I probably would have found it if I actually had the yield return sitting inside of an if brackets. I used to have that rule where I would put brackets. I would always put brackets after my if statements, after my while statements, after my for statements, just to call out that even if it's one line it's doing, it's still going to call that out and identify it. And eventually I came to the conclusion that I never figured out a reason why it was actually important. And though this may seem pretty light, this was a reason. This was a reason it became important again. Because I completely missed this. Now, honestly, I think Visual Studio should have identified it. If it wanted to outline everything here, like first of all, as soon as I put this line in here, it made the assumption the method type was wrong. This return statement does not do the same. This return statement assumes that not only is the current one wrong, but you have another one that should be there, and because that other one should be there, you should be using a different return type here. That's how ingrained this exception, this error is in Visual Studio, that this can't possibly be a string method. You only have two spots where you're returning strings. You're trying to return yield null once, so obviously that's the problem. Okay. Anyway, so this was a pain in the butt. I was trying to search for stuff. Eventually I did find it for other reasons, like I was trying to look into this. after the fact and find out like what's going on with it. And when I look at this error, let's go over to this error up at the top. One of the things is you can see in the comments, it says, hey, here's this exception, we're explaining that. It's also a link. It's a link, so you can click on it. So I want to do that. I want to click on it, and somewhere in my system, I should have a tab coming up. Somewhere, maybe. F1? Does F1 work anymore? No. Maybe I actually have a copy of Visual Studio running. Oh, great. It was running. It's been running. So here's the error. The body of accessor cannot be an iterator block because type is not an iterator interface type. The error occurs if an iterator accessor is used, but the return type is not one of the iterator type interfaces. So in this case, yield return 1 where we just have a single integer. Now if they actually showed the errors, the underline errors, I mean, this is where it's happening. Well, technically it's happening on the getter. But this kind of pointed some stuff out here. This is just, this line of code is forcing Visual Studio in the build environment to think that this line is broken. Alright, it was tough. This was a really tough find. And actually, this was not the specific one that helped me figure out the problem. Let's go back a little bit. Oh, it loaded it up a bunch of times. Enumerable. I was looking at enumerators. Nope, not those ones. Let's go back to Visual Studio, and I'm going to look up one of these other ones. Okay. Yeah, I don't know exactly which one it was. But it was pointing out that I had a yield statement. So, oh yeah, that was it. It was the yield statement. It was pointing out that I had the yield statement and finding it in here and seeing that if there's a yield statement, it's going to trigger this stuff. Particularly in this one, that the yield return. So I started looking for yield returns. Eventually, I ended up finding it in my code when I searched for yield. And I was able to find it hiding at the end. So a couple things in here is, one, take advantage of the curly brackets just to put bodies around if statements, the contents of the action for an if statement. And yield return null is one of the most horrible errors that you could sneak up and write in somebody's code when they're not looking. Somebody leaves their computer unlocked. Don't bother putting up a David Hasselhoff background on their computer. Go find some of their C# code and just put a yield return null in there. They're going to spend forever trying to figure that one out. All right. Now I did also post this one up to Microsoft as an error, trying to get them to change this so that yield return null at least gets its own comment for the exception. That we should assume first that if the method definition is actually written accurately, that the return statement line should be considered the point of fault. At least, or that either one of them, both of them should get highlighted, and that the explanations on them should be clear enough that it actually calls out that you should be looking for yield return nulls. Did you not intend to have a yield return null inside of your code?